Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. My name is Youngmoo Kim. I'm director of the Excite Center at Drexel University. And so on behalf of Drexel, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this new academic year and the return of our Learning Innovation Conversation series. At the dawn of each new school year, many of us have this opportunity to try out new ideas and approaches. And we are thrilled to be joined tonight by distinguished speaker Katrina Stevens. Yes, Katrina said, woohoo! Yes. And she'll share her perspectives on strategies for incorporating novel tools and practices, both in the classroom and on larger scales. Now, I'm sure you're as eager as I am to hear from Katrina, but please allow me to provide some very quick updates about the Excite Center and learning innovation. Like most of you, we've had a very, very busy summer at Excite. In June, we presented Drumhenge, a unique fusion of art and technology to create a new musical performance. For this project, composer Peter English and Drexel graduate student Jeff Gregorio received a 2017 Philly Geek Award for Makers of the Year. So congrats to them. Yes. In July, we launched Young Dragons, which introduced 50 middle school students right in our neighborhood, here in the West Philadelphia Promise Zone, to 2 weeks of integrated STEAM activities. For those of you who are new here, STEAM is STEM integrated with arts and design. We are honored to partner with Eagle Safety, Malcolm Jenkins, and his foundation for this program. In August, we hosted the 11th year of our Summer Music Technology program. This is our flagship STEAM program for high school students from across Greater Philadelphia. In just 1 week, students in the program create new apps, musical robots, and custom guitar effects with little or no prior experience in electronics or programming. And finally, earlier this month, we staged the world premiere of Sophia's Forest, a new opera by award-winning composer Lembit Beecher, which featured robotic sound sculptures designed and built by Drexel students. This project was produced with major support from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage. You can learn more about all of these projects at the Excite Center website. And each of these examples involves students making technology and creativity, which we believe lie at the very heart of innovation. Learning innovation was created to better connect these and other emerging approaches with those of us engaged with learning, whether as teachers, parents, coaches, or as Mimi Ito would say, learning heroes, to impact how students learn in Philadelphia. How does this happen? We believe it takes a multifaceted approach. For Excite, this means creative approaches to learning, and I mean that in the literal sense, where we actually create things that incorporate tools and knowledge from a variety of disciplines: technology, making, gaming, and other ways of engaging with information and data. But there are many different approaches and perspectives that provide the inspiration for innovation and learning, and that's where this speaker series has been and comes from. We've hosted 3 innovators so far in this series and learned a tremendous amount from each of them. John Maida, who joined us back in January, spoke to us about the need to infuse learning with a transdisciplinary approach. Mimi Ito, in March, focused on the importance of mentorship and learning heroes as part of an overall supportive network for learning that helps elevate some students while all too often leaving other students without social capital behind. And Leah Beakley shared her experience as a maker and an entrepreneur, and how opportunities for learning can be stymied by preconceived notions about what is appropriate for students based on gender or economic background. If you weren't able to join us for any of those conversations, I encourage you to watch videos of those events, which are available at that URL, drexel.edu/learninginnovation. Each of these conversations is intended to plant seeds for what is possible so that we spur our own creativity right here in Philadelphia around new methods and practices. So I'm sure you're eager to know, where do we go from here? Well, we're starting with tonight, of course, with a presentation by Katrina Stevens. Now, after tonight's event, we have 2 upcoming conversations in October and November. On October 24th, we will welcome Dr. Christopher Emden, an associate professor in the Department of Mathematics, Science, and Technology at Teachers College, Columbia University. He also serves as Director of Science Education at the Center for Health Equity and Urban Science Education. He is the Associate Director of the Institute for Urban and Minority Teachers at Teachers College and the author of a New York Times bestseller that you may have heard of, which is titled "For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too." He was a featured keynote speaker at the most recent South by Southwest EDU conference. Can't wait to hear his presentation in October. In November, we welcome, on November 28th, Dr. Melina Unkefer, Director of the Education Program at Neuroscape, the UCSF Neuroscience Center. She uses neuroimaging to investigate how students learn in the classroom and will speak to us about how attention affects learning and memory, and we'll discuss how that fits with some of the promising practices we've learned throughout the course of this series. So, again, on October 24th and November 28th, mark your calendars. Registration for the October event is open now, like right now. Like if you go to excite.ticketleap.com, you can actually register. And just to provide a little bit of extra incentive, for the first 5 people who register, I will give you one of these very cool Excite Center Learning Innovation pens. It's also a stylus, also a flashlight. No, but in all seriousness, I do encourage you to register. We do have some of these pens for the first 5 who do. You can register right now. That link is available. So, why are we doing all of this? What is this initiative about? Well, just to remind you, our initiative seeks to build a community to advance the conversations around education beyond buzzwords and local constraints to identify and pursue successful models. We've all seen this sea of terminology, all these terms. Many of us use them, apply them in our practices. Many more don't really know what they mean or become confused about the terminology. So this is a way of cutting through that and trying to get to the essence of many of our shared interests. So what does this community look like? Well, we've been, of course, surveying you, asking you questions throughout this entire series. I'm quite proud that at our previous events, our attendees reflect a huge diversity of different disciplines. Of course, many from education, but also from technology, from research, from advocacy, from healthcare even. That learning innovation is a challenge and an opportunity that is shared by all of us. We've also asked you about your interests, not just where you work, but what are you most interested in. And of course, from the 3 events in the spring and from our email surveys throughout, we know that, again, a diversity of interests. And for us, it's very exciting that these transdisciplinary perspectives continually remind us that we need to engage across boundaries, that one discipline likely doesn't hold the entire solution to this problem. So there is interest, of course, in every level of learning, including lifelong learning, which is certainly an outcome we seek to promote. And we also, I'll just point out here that the network graph, the network lines here, are the folks who have signed up voluntarily for our email list. So there are many more who are getting these updates, who are getting this information and responding to our queries than who are able to attend the events as well. So we're constantly looking for ways to further engage those folks too. Now, as we move from summer to fall, our goal for learning innovation is to move from an inspiration phase to an implementation phase. We want the Learning Innovation Network, this community that we are building, to be a place where we can share ways to improve student learning across different kinds of institutions and move past some of the jargon that stops the conversation rather than moving it forward. We all know we face enormous challenges amidst extremely limited resources, But this network hopes to spark interest and unlock the potential for all students, regardless of the tools and technology they have access to. So by being here tonight, you are part of this network, but more specifically, we want to engage, we want you to engage with us by answering one question. What's one idea that you have for moving learning innovation from inspiration to implementation? What's the one thing you think that we can do, create, or build together as a community to move this forward? Now, as usual, we will follow up from this event with an email survey, survey via email and Twitter. So you'll be able to answer this question. I'm giving it to you now so you can put some thought into it. But you can answer this question on the survey. And if you provide your email in the survey, then you will also receive an invitation to an exclusive event. It's a meeting. No, you'll receive an invitation to then come collaborate with us and design with us at an event this fall where we'll collect these ideas and to talk about and discuss and form a pathway towards implementation, for tangible steps towards implementation. So once again, look for the survey after this event. Please answer the question. If you don't want to include your email, that's fine. If you do include your email, we'll send you also an invitation to come continue this discussion with us in person. Okay, one more update. Lots of facets to this initiative. Again, and you may have heard this from Technically Philly, we are also working to learn as much as we can about emerging makerspaces in environments that support innovation and learning. This effort is led by my colleagues, Drs. Brian Smith and Kareem Edouard, along with graduate student Caitlin Bright. For the last 6 months, this team has been surveying spaces across the country in an attempt to understand the ingredients of successful learning in makerspaces. They have visited 25 different makerspaces across the country, from the West Coast, Southwest, Midwest, and East Coast, taking a deep dive to not only look at making equipment and projects, but overall mission, sustainability, and connectedness to communities. As you can guess, there's an incredible variety to maker spaces and activities that are being engaged with across the country. So we are going through that. We have collected a lot of information about that, including interviews and studies at these sites. If you are a makerspace or a part of a makerspace here in Philadelphia and have not already engaged with us, we invite you to contact us. We would love to come to visit your space as well and to include you in this survey. If you're interested in that opportunity, please email us just at excite@drexel.edu. And we look forward to hearing from you. So later this fall, we will share the preliminary results of that research with a full report to come in early 2018, in which we'll share recommendations for implementation. So again, if you're interested in this work in general, please sign up for updates at the Learning Innovation website. Of course, there are many people I have to thank for their assistance in putting this event together. Our thanks to the reporters and editors at the Philadelphia Citizen, Technically, and WHYY's Newsworks Tonight for helping us to continue to reach new audiences through their coverage of learning innovation. And I want to especially thank our supporter for this series and the Learning Innovation Initiative overall, Jessica Berwood. Please join me in thanking Jessica and her colleagues who have made this conversation possible. Okay, so now I know you're thinking, finally, let's get on with the show. A couple more points of order. Following this presentation, of course, we will kick things off with a question and answer conversation. As usual, I'll kick things off with the speaker, but we will have 2 microphones on either side, on either aisle, and we invite you to come to the microphones to ask your questions. You can also tweet questions, as usual, to @ExciteCenter, but you can also text your questions to that number right there. And if you want to go ahead and send a test text right now, please feel free to do so. We'll give you the number again during the Q&A as well. But that number, you can text your questions, and I'll receive those. And then, of course, we hope you'll tweet about the event at #LearningInnovation. Following the presentation, please join us for a reception right afterwards in the lobby so that we can get to know each other a little better. And remember, you will get an email survey. Please fill it. That's how we know, that helps guide us in our initiative. And so we hope you'll take the time to fill that out. And of course, connect with us and get invited to the exclusive collaboration event. Okay, finally. I am thrilled to have joining us today our distinguished speaker. She is an innovator in education technology with over 20 years of experience as a teacher and administrator in Baltimore County schools, with a track record of building strong, forward-thinking education programs. She continues to be a key player in Baltimore's education technology ecosystem. From 2015 until January of this year, January 20th, I believe, she served as Deputy Director of the Office of Educational Technology in the United States Department of Education. As Deputy Director, she led the work for Rapid Cycle Tech Evaluations, Future Ready, EdTech Developer Outreach, and the Education Innovation Clusters. She has served as the Director of the EdSurge Summit and is also a contributing writer to EdSurge, and is the founding Executive Director of EdTech Maryland. She also has strong ties to Philadelphia, having lived here for 9 years and having received a master's in English literature from Temple University. She also, little known fact, this is trivia, she taught a course on business communications right here at Drexel. In her many roles, she has fostered collaboration among educators, edtech startups, researchers, and community leaders. Please join me in welcoming Katrina Stevens.
So good evening. Thanks for coming out, especially when it was pouring down rain. I also know many of you are probably educators, and this is a tough time of the year to be out and about. There's a lot of things that I know that you have that are competing interests. So I really appreciate you guys come out this evening. And you're going to see me kind of moving back and forth between the podium and here. But basically, the system for EdTech in terms of buying and identifying and using EdTech is broken. We're spending billions of dollars and without really knowing what parts of those are actually working. And in fact, over $13 billion, in fact, that we're spending in K-12. And if we add higher ed to that, that's another $24 billion. So we're spending a lot of money, and we don't really know exactly whether or not that's making a real difference and in what ways. And given the circumstances right now with we don't assume that our budgets are going to get any bigger. The resources that teachers have in terms of time, those are not going to expand. So we need to be really thoughtful about how we're using the money and the resources that we have. So in the next 45 minutes, I'm really going to talk about how can we actually do this better? How can we create a system where we are better making decisions around EdTech? But before I do that, I want to know a little bit about you guys. So I'm going to ask a few questions. So we are going to, let's see if this works. Okay, so you want to pull out a smart device of some kind. And each of these questions, you're going to be sending them to Excite, and then to 22333. And so the first one, and for this question, you can answer more than one. A lot of you probably play multiple roles. And it should happen live, if all goes well. I see we have a researcher. So no classroom teachers? Oh, so you can put more than one. Yes, you can actually, you can actually respond more than once. So if there's other roles that you play. So, okay. Yeah, just like raise your hand. How many classroom teachers do we have here? So we've got a few. Okay. The setting may have gotten. We did a lot of transferring from one thing to another, so that may have happened. Okay, so we've got a nice mix of folks who are here. Okay. Now I'm going to go to the next question. Okay. So have you piloted EdTech for your classroom? That could be for your own, you wanted to pilot something yourself, or whether or not you did it for your school, or whether or not you did it for your district. So this one should be easy, yes or no. If in higher ed, did you help somebody? Were you part of researching or do anything connected to a pilot? Oh, it didn't come up with the, let's see. Let's go back. Well, and this is the reality of tech, right? So you always have a backup plan if things go wrong in your classroom. I even have slides I could pull up and do it by like having you raise your hand. So, okay. But it seems like a number of you have, in fact, piloted. Okay. Oops. Yeah, it's jumping ahead. Let's go. Let's try this one. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Now that I know a little bit about you, we're going to take a little quiz. And you're going to be on your honor on this. You're going to put your answers in. So how many higher ed institutions are there in the US? I'll give you guys a minute to. Colleges and universities, it could be 2 years as well. 2 years would be included for this. That's a good question. There you go. People settled on. It's actually 7,000. So there are 7,000 in the US. Okay. Let's try another one. How many K-12 institutions are there? So your choices are 50,000, 100,000, 150, or 200,000. That seems to be settling a little bit. There are 100,000. So there are roughly 100,000. All right. One more question. Okay. In the past 2 years, how many schools have gained access to broadband? All right, I think it's settling now. So the correct answer is actually 50,000. So about 2 years, a little over 2 years ago, we were about 30,000 when we started the Connect Ed initiative out of the White House. And the most recent survey, we've got about 83,000 schools who are now connected. So in the last 2 years, we had this huge shift in terms of access. And you want to think about this happening in like rural schools. So this is literally kind of all over the country and places that have never had it before. Okay. All right, so now I'm hoping you remember how you did on your quiz. Oh, sorry, I had one more question here. So this one, you should be able to answer multiple. If it doesn't, then this won't quite work. But what counts as evidence? Which of these different documents, different assets would count as evidence? Is it letting you do more than one? How many researchers do we have in the room? Quite a few. I could tell. Yep. All right. So this one, it depends. And so I'm going to talk a lot about this later in the conversation. But clearly, like, when we think about research, for sure, we talk about like, peer-reviewed journal. That's kind of the gold standard for research. But we're going to talk about like other kinds of things can count as evidence as well, depending what decision you're making. Okay. Now, so now you remember what you scored. So this is how you're going to score yourself. You want to divide the total number of questions by the number of the questions you got wrong. And then I want you to take that, and I want you to multiply that by the number from question number 6. Everybody got that? Okay. All right. So it doesn't really matter how you score. This is a really kind of a sense to just find out who you guys are. But the procurement process for the United States is incredibly complicated. It is slow moving. It is archaic. It is sluggish. This is really kind of something that has not changed in really almost 30 plus years. When I try to explain procurement process and how like ed tech companies can get into schools, this is what it feels like and sounds like. It isn't really that far off in terms of the process that you have to go through in terms of how you find ed tech, how you then go through getting approval from your school. It's different from district to district. It's different from school to school. So the whole process in terms of how we figure this stuff out and how we make decisions is very much broken and convoluted and unclear. And we're not using evidence to do it at all. Not at all, but we're rarely using evidence. This is a survey that Digital Promise did not long ago with Johns Hopkins. And you can see that we really rely more on our peer recommendations than we rely on evidence. I did the same thing. When I was principal and when I worked in central office in Baltimore County Public Schools, I called my colleagues. I wanted to know what teacher down the road or what school down the road, what they were using, and then that was the first place I looked to be able to figure that out. So this is kind of how we do things. And so one of the things I'd like to advocate is that we actually start using more evidence as we make these decisions. The other thing is that some people are okay with how this process works, but a lot of people really aren't. Interesting, like the providers, people who are creating ed tech are really feeling like they're disconnected from it. Superintendents are the happiest because they really get to say, hey, I want that ordered. I want that now. One of the things that I find, I think, a little troubling is that when you look at this, like who actually is involved in the process, the further away you are from the actual using that tool, the more say you have. And so if you look at teachers and you look at students, who are the main users of this, they have the least say in some of this. So one of the things I really want to look at is like how can we change that? I want to see more transparency in the ecosystem so that we have more information to be able to make decisions, and then also just really more educator voice. I think that there's a place actually for student voice too, depending on what the tools are. So one question I would ask is like, what would it look like if, in fact, teachers could find the information that they wanted when they wanted it? I am an ELL teacher, and I have ELL students in my classroom. I am looking for an app or some kind of platform that would allow me to be able to help a couple of students that just moved into my classroom. Right now, where do you go look? You probably Google first, and then you probably go talk to some colleagues. You might look around a little bit. Then you might have a couple of resources of things that you can find. There are some people working on this. There's organizations that are trying to create and pull some of this information to be able to find it. The EdSearch has an EdTech index, so they're cataloging all of the EdTech that's out there, and they have some reviews on there. Common Sense has ratings and reviews. They have a mix of experts who go in and do an analysis, and then they have educators who talk about how they implement those things. Learn Platform is similarly trying to capture all of the apps that are out there. Interestingly, and we'll talk about why, 3 of these that still actually have their assets available basically are not producing anything new because the ecosystem doesn't really have any way to pay for any of this. So it's something everybody wants, but nobody's figured out any kind of real business model to make it work. And it's not really the information that you want. It's not in a place that people can find. It's not enough of substance for people to do that. Okay. Oops, I went a little fast. Okay. So what if we had a consumer reports for ed tech? Like what if we're able to do the same kind of process when you're purchasing or making a decision about what you want to do? So I want to imagine that we are buying a car. I'm going to use that as a comparison. I've got to go over here for this. Okay. Now, if your friends have a car that's really reliable, maybe your parents have a car, your family always used a particular brand, you're probably going to look there first. Similarly, if ed tech, if there's things that people are using. Let's see if this works. So there are reasons why you would want to like go check out something someone else has. But if you are a good consumer, which I'm sure all of you are, you're probably also going to go and talk to and go look at things like Consumer Reports or other kinds of publications or other places like that to get that kind of information. You also can make a decision about whether or not you want like the latest model of something. If you get the latest model of a car that's been kind of rebuilt, then you know there might be some glitches, there could be some recalls, there might be some things that we don't know enough about. But you might really like that new thing, and so you really want to actually try that. Or you can go with a model that's been around for a while. It's tried and true, and it's something that this is like the 6th version of this particular kind of car, and so you know exactly what you're expecting. Same thing for ed tech. There are some districts that have more of an appetite for risk or for novelty or innovation, and then others that really need to have something that's been around for a long time and they know exactly what it looks like. You also want to know what conditions that car was driven in. It matters to you a lot. So if you drive in the snow a lot on your way to work, you want to make sure that the car that you're buying actually works in the snow. If you are in hilly areas or places that dirt roads, similarly, you want to does the car work there? Did they test it out in those places? So similarly, you want to think about for buying and purchasing ed tech. You want it to, does it work in your scenario? If you've got kids who are struggling to read, then you're going to want a different tool than if in fact that's not what you're dealing with. So you want to have something that's been tested not just kind of like on the perfect environment. You want to make sure that's like literally in classrooms or in roads that are realistic. Okay? You also want to take it out for a test drive. You want to get a feel for it. What does it feel like? Does it drive? Does it fit the way you want to drive in the conditions you want to? You also, as you might have noticed, I'm not particularly tall. So when I go buy cars, there's a lot of cars I can't buy because I literally can't see over the steering wheel and reach the pedals at the same time. So I have to try it out. And similarly, like when you're buying a car, you want to get in there and figure it out. Same thing for ed tech. If you are getting something, it can be the perfect, amazing thing down the road. Like this teacher is doing this crazy things with her kids. But if it doesn't feel right to you, doesn't fit how you think about it, or fit your kids, then it's not going to be the right fit for you. So that would be the ideal, that we have this Consumer Reports ed tech ecosystem where we can go and you can find out all this information, all of it's tailored exactly for exactly what a teacher or educator is looking for. But that's not really how it works now. Okay. This is the ideal. You want this self-driving car. It comes out perfect. It does exactly what you want it to do. Same thing for the ed tech tool. You're looking for an ed tech tool that comes out of the box. You just plug it in, you use it with your students, and suddenly magically they learn to read, or whatever other kind of skill that you're trying to get them to do. In reality, there are no ed tech tools. I've never seen an ed tech tool that some educator hasn't hacked at least a little bit to make it work in their classroom or in their district. And we're not quite there in terms of the kinds of tools I think that we're going to end up having. So similarly, there's a hacked version that it does what you want it to do, but you've had to do a lot to get it there. You can't just simply go buy this. When teachers are going and they're looking for the information about a particular tool or to solve a problem that they're trying to do, it exists. There's bits and pieces of it all over the place, but it's not in a package that they can do it. And I was a teacher, I was an administrator. The thing that I wanted more than anything was time. And so if you're taking away time that I've got to go look for all this stuff to figure this out, that's less time I have to actually figure out what to do within a classroom. Cars, you can go and get this little sticker on it. It's on every single car. You get all this information about it. But in education, it's like, well, we don't really have an idea. Or we'll tell you in 4 years when our research study is done. Then we'll know. By that time, you've had entire high school classes all go through for you. It's complicated. We don't really know. So the way the ecosystem is structured now, we're not getting enough information for educators to be able to make good decisions about what they're identifying for ed tech and how they're using that. If a process exists, it's more like the kind of kick the tires approach. It's like, well, why don't you try it for a week and see if your kids like it? That's often the process that we use. Okay. So if we know we want this, and this would be really useful, I've never talked to an educator that hasn't been like, yes, I would love to have that. Give me the Consumer Reports for ed tech. So why don't we have it already? And there's just a lot of different barriers that are in place. The supply and demand has been the biggest issue up till now. We haven't been able to have really enough supply on one end to create the demand on the other. There have been a number of people who've tried on both sides, but some of these companies or some of these organizations or efforts have not been successful because you can create a lot of supply, but if nobody's looking for it, then it doesn't matter, same thing. It's also complicated because no one is really quite sure how to pay for it yet. We're now starting to see where these things are actually starting to come together, where we are starting to be able to see both sides of this. Okay. Everyone wants this, but nobody wants to pay for it. And we don't want to have the price of the products increase either. So that's it's been one of the biggest issues for this. It is the momentum of decades of procurement systems trying to move against. There's a lot of things, again, if you guys are in school districts or if you're in higher ed, there are a lot of things that you've just always done that way. It's like, well, why do we do that? Well, that's just the process. That's the procedure. And trying to go through some of those things. For procurement itself, a lot of those rules come from the state. And they are often rules that aren't for ed tech. It's for like buying school buses. And so, again, you kind of have to hack it to work. I remember the first time we were, when I was in Baltimore County, there was a policy that you had to put out your textbook on a table in front of the board meeting for 30 days before the board meeting. And we were trying to figure out how to do it. Like we were trying to get this digital program. So we had iPads, which of course kept disappearing. It's like the early days. Like there was no way to do it. Like we were trying to follow the rules, but we couldn't quite figure it out. So there's a disconnect between how those structures are in place. Again, like this stuff is just, and going back to this, like it's just slow, it's cumbersome, it's old, it's complicated. So it's like everyone kind of throws up their hands and like, well, that's just how it's done. I've also, like, talking to a lot of people over the last few years, everybody thinks that it's important to do, but everyone says it's somebody else's problem. They should be doing that. And everyone feels like they are also kind of misunderstood in that. So educators really, really wish that companies were producing this. Actually, companies and other organizations that create really good tools get really frustrated with educators because they feel like they are buying things because of cool marketing. If you go into the vendor hall, like there's all kinds of like stuff to get teachers to come and stop at your table. It's about that kind of flash and not about the substance. And so if you're kind of a small young company that is innovative and you have actually something that might have some real value, it's hard to get through all that noise. There's also some unspoken secrets around the fact that like superintendents will go out to really nice dinners sometimes, or others, and that can foster these relationships. And then people who have the money to do those things, they're the ones who actually end up getting the contracts. Researchers feel underappreciated and like their stuff is underutilized. They spend lots and lots of time figuring something out, and then no educator actually ends up using it. So they get really frustrated by that. Investors don't encourage their companies to spend money on doing research studies or efficacy because it doesn't actually help the bottom line. No one's asking for it yet. And the truth is, too, we didn't really have the ability to do some of this before. It's only until recently where we actually are able to get some of this data that we can actually start to track that and say, like, oh, okay, that actually, we even know how much people are using nowadays. Okay. Major companies benefit from the status quo. So it works for them. If you are some of the large publishing companies, all the status around like throwing nice parties at conferences, it's been effective. Similar large research institutions, I worked in DC, and there's a number of them, like, they depend on those government contracts, and they're very, very large contracts that are like multi-year. So to think about doing something a little differently and it's kind of more rapid cycle evaluations can be a threat to how those are done. Now, in terms of research, so there is absolutely a role for kind of traditional research, but the way that works doesn't really function particularly well with how schools really need that information. So I want to dig in a little bit and talk about kind of why traditional research does not actually work well. So first, this is how kind of things are done. I'm assuming a lot of you know some of this, but basically you set up a study, you have one group that's your control group, you have your experiment group who are getting the treatment. After you get everyone set up, you try to take all of the other factors out as much as you can. A year or two after they've been using it, you test the two kids in the different sets, and if the kids do better than what they're using the app, then you attribute that to the app. So that's kind of how we do it right now. But in essence, that really just takes too long. An educator needs to know, like, I'm teaching a couple weeks from now, or I'm trying to put together my budget's due, and I've got to be able to make some decisions. So they need that information much more quickly. It also, in terms of the way how fast ed tech is developed, like we have ed tech products popping up so fast that even if we could find a process to be able to do that, just volume alone, we would not be able to do this. And it's just too expensive. A really inexpensive research study is like $250K. Well, it takes $50K to build some of these apps. So if you're building something, you're not going to spend that much extra money just to do the evaluation on it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you're a district and something's free or really low cost, similarly, you've got a ton of those. It's not worth your money to do that. If you're spending a lot of money, or like you're looking at reading scores or something that's really critical, then you might actually do a study if you're a large district. But collectively across the country, again, going back to that number, we've spent over $13 billion. It's just scattered all over. So part of it's like, how can we collect all of that and make some sense of it? It's also not iterative. And so often traditional research is more like a snapshot. You want to try to keep everything as steady as you can so that you can actually see what's making the difference. And I'm sure all of you periodically see like every couple of weeks, you need to update to your app, to your phone, to your this. And the process of ed tech is continually changing. And so oftentimes you'll start with a study, and the tool that you have by the end of that study no longer makes any sense. It's like no longer the same tool. With doing some work over at with IES, with the What Works Clearinghouse, all of the stuff that was kind of pre-Common Core suddenly was not even helpful anymore. And it took years for them to kind of be able to catch up and get there. So the pace of the way research is done is just, and the process doesn't quite match ed tech. And similarly, really it's serving a very different purpose. So traditional research is about a high confidence of certainty that there's a causal connection. You know for a fact that this caused this, and that's kind of the kind of classic RCT model is designed to give you that information. There are things we really want to know that about how students learn. So there's absolutely a place for it. But what educators really often want is they want to know, is it likely to help my kids? Like, here's who my students are, here's how I teach, here's kind of the paradigm of it. Is it a good shot? Is there a good chance that this will do it? They don't need causal connection. They just want to have a good, yeah, it probably will work. Or it's not going to work with my students. So. And then context is incredibly important. When we talk about what works, and I'm going to talk about in a second, it's really like what works for whom in what context. It matters a great deal. And going back to your car, it can be great if it works all the time, except when it rains. Then if you live in a place like Seattle, you maybe don't want that car. So it's like thinking similar in classrooms. If it doesn't really work well with ELL students, it's not the tool for you. If it doesn't work well in rural communities, or if it's designed for a place that's project-based learning. So it's really like we need to be capturing this. There are tools that work really well for young new teachers or really experienced teachers, and we have no way we are not tracking that information right now. Okay. I mean, one size does not fit all. It doesn't fit all students, it doesn't fit all schools, it does not fit all teachers. And if we're trying to go for the one size fits all ed tech store, it just doesn't exist. So I really kind of want to dive in now in terms of finding out what works and with whom and with what context. So what if we designed a system where we were able to actually capture that information around context, so that every time a tool was used, we'd actually know all the things around how it was used, how it was implemented, what the experience of the teacher was, what the students were like, how much professional development did that teacher get. There are people who are working on parts of this. So the Gates Foundation funded what's called the Learning Assembly, 7 different communities across the US. They're trying to look at kind of test beds, doing professional development with teachers, mostly around personalized learning, trying to capture and find out all that kind of context piece around it. The first kind of big project with doing rapid cycle evaluations was the iZone. Leap Innovations has been the national convener for doing this kind of work around the rapid cycle evaluations. LearnLaunch has just now launched they've been doing a lot of stuff in Boston, but now launched a statewide initiative, again, to kind of work with schools that are looking at personalized learning and trying to figure out what's working, what's not working. Okay. Rhode Island is doing some amazing things in terms of really kind of pulling their community together, working with higher ed and working with school districts to be able to figure out some of this. And then the people are building tools to kind of help this process too. So EduStar is a platform that runs kind of RCTs in the background, and it helps people find out what tools are working and which ones are not. Digital Promise has a whole set of tools that are resources around how do you do pilots. Harvard University has something called the Proving Ground, and they're looking at district administrative data to kind of figure out what's working in what context. A project that I was fortunate enough to work on when I was at Ed was called the EdTech Rapid Cycle Evaluation Coach. This is a completely free tool. You can use it now. It's not only just free, it's also openly licensed, which means you can actually ask for the code. So if you wanted to use it, do it. I feel strongly that once people have paid tax dollars for something, they shouldn't have to keep paying it. So we built that into the contract that would be designed that way. But it is designed to be able to walk through, to help an educator be able to do some of these in our own classroom or to do them on a school-wide or a district-wide. So it helps, it's almost like almost Mad Libs in some parts of it. It literally walks you through like how do you create that first research question. And then at the end of it, it tells you like what to make sense of that. It actually runs the data for you as well. And then it leads you to think about, okay, so now that you know that, it probably raises more questions. There are probably things that you now need to find out. So it's this idea of kind of continually doing this kind of evaluation and continually figuring out what's working and what needs to get tweaked. We'll be sending out that URL with the note, but it's edtechrce.org if anyone is interested. So I was talking before about like why it hasn't happened. I think that now is actually a time where it's much more likely to happen. There's a lot of things that are coming together right now that make me think in the next couple of years that we might be able to really start figuring this out and actually making this work. We're starting to see the smart demand and smart supply really starting to come together. We're starting to see funders putting money behind those projects to be able to get them enough legs to be able to move forward. Access. The fact that we now have all those schools are coming online, there's more schools that are starting to make some decisions about it. Plus, we've had schools now that have been online for enough time that we can go back and look at data. And we can kind of look and see, oh, okay, they tried this, and they've been using this for 3, 4, or 5 years. What does that look like? So we finally have access to that information. Okay. Machine learning, even in the last year, we've made some incredible progress in machine learning, and even just sophisticated web scraping that make this a lot easier moving forward. ESSA, built into ESSA, it actually has more requirements for evidence-based practices and evidence-based buying decisions. So we even have now, depending on how that gets implemented, but the law actually includes this. This was something that was important to Congress. We're starting to see research practice partnerships pop up everywhere. There's quite a number of them here in Philadelphia. Drexel has been doing a number of these as well, where you have researchers working hand in hand with practitioners, with educators, and really working on figuring out what's working and how to implement something together. We're also starting to see, like Jefferson Education has been taking a lead role as a convener. They're starting to pull together all the different stakeholder groups. And in fact, back in April, we had an event where 6 months prior to this, we had 150 people who were working in 10 different groups with each a specific question where they were addressing ed tech and evidence. One group was looking at K-12 decision making. One looked at higher ed. One looked at what does philanthropy look like. One was looking at companies. So kind of digging in and really looking to find out what the next things to get funded were. And then in April, we brought together 275 stakeholders, spent 2 days kind of digging through this and figuring out the next steps. And for me, I had this complete geek moment because I was looking out at the audience and I realized, like, these are all my people. Like, no one else has cared about evidence and ed tech before. And so it was fun to actually just kind of see everybody together thinking and working on this stuff. This is also a project I'm really excited about. I'm on the advisory for this. This Curry School of Education at UVA is putting together the National Education Research Database, which is being called NERD. So I'm in the advisory mostly just because I want the swag. I want the nerd hat. I want the nerd T-shirt and all this stuff. But once this is in place, and they've actually already pulled together 3,000 profiles, the idea for this is that you would be able to match researchers more easily. So you'd be able to, so if a school wants somebody who's already done a Wetworks clearinghouse, they can find somebody. If they want a research student, PhD candidate who's looking for something local, if they want somebody who really understands project-based learning, to be able to do that kind of matching. And I know I spent some time talking about why traditional research doesn't work particularly well in ed tech. That is not to say that we don't need researchers. I actually would like to see the ecosystem where we have more touches with researchers. So instead of a researcher coming in and saying, I need your students for the next 3 years, I want to test out this kind of practice, that it would be rather, and even in the RC Coach that we created, there are moments where it says, if you don't have somebody on staff who does this, then here's the moment that you should go and talk to a researcher and get them to look at your question or to look at your results. The vision would be that schools would actually be able to see researchers as a resource for them, to be able to help them kind of think through and set up some of these questions in a less expensive way, but more touches, and so that evidence and research is more part of the process. All of these organizations, we are finally now starting to be able to come together. You're starting to see like we're actually starting to move in the same direction. And I felt like that was happening at the April convening, and that group is continuing, so that's going to be meeting annually. Okay. And this is kind of a personal thing about why I think that this is more possible. I was one of those teachers who hated tech. Like when I first started teaching, I was an English teacher. I was all about the books. I had a chalkboard, an actual chalkboard, so I always had chalk hands all over me. And that's what I loved. It was all about the relationship with students. That's what I cared deeply about. I was the last person to get a flip phone. Somebody asked me about that in an interview. I finally did it because I was teaching in a rural place, and I had students who were going to transport. And I was like, okay, I need to do this for safety reasons. I'm finally going to go ahead and get this phone. And then now, like that journey is kind of taking me to the office of a tech. So I think that any teacher, for me, that was about discovering that I worked in Bermuda for 3 years. I was helping kind of set up a system over there. And I couldn't bring in the expertise for my students without using digital technology. So for me, that was that transition about suddenly tech could do something for my students that I couldn't do before. So I think any teacher can actually kind of embrace technology. One other thing about it is that all classrooms are research labs. Like we're already doing this work. We've got teachers right now who are trying something, in fact, like literally across the country. We have ed tech, people who are trying pilots, and in lots of other parts of the country, like hundreds of these teachers across the country. Just think if we could actually capture what they were all learning and be able to put that in one place so that other teachers could actually learn from that. We are losing, so not only are we losing what those teachers are learning, but we're literally losing teachers every year. 8% of our teachers, and we never get any of that back. We don't get to know anything about what they learned. Students don't benefit from that. The system doesn't benefit from it. We're not capturing what teachers are learning. Okay. I'm actually going to skip this video just for time, but it's kind of a crazy classroom. So, one of the things that, when I'm talking about lab classrooms, I'm not saying that like suddenly we should have labs that are perfectly set up in every classroom. It's more that when we're testing out tools, we should not be testing them in lab situations. We should be testing them out in real classrooms. What do real classrooms look like? And sometimes my classroom would look like that. I also want to be careful about language. When we talk about doing things like I intervened when we were doing the rapid cycle evaluation project when they were first setting up a pilot. The letter that they were sending home to the parents included quasi-experimental, testbed, and experiment. I was like, we're not going to send that to parents. Like, they're not going to understand what we're talking about. So you have to be careful of the language that you're using. But we are actually doing these kinds of experiments every single day in our classrooms. I did this with my students once, where I wanted them to actually learn what kind of vocabulary tricks worked for them, what techniques. So 1 week we did like flashcards. The next one we did these kind of elaborate flashcards. We even tried peppermint, because that's supposed to help with memory. By the end of that quarter, my students each could actually articulate and say, these are the combos that help me learn vocabulary better. So we're experimenting every day as a teacher. I would try something. I would have a hypothesis that if I taught something this way, this is what would happen. Some of my students I wouldn't work with, and so I would try something else and try something else. Teachers do this every single day, and that is that kind of experimental mindset. The next time I taught that, I would incorporate all the things that I learned, and I would do that in the first time around. So we just need to encourage an experimental mindset. And finally, what could we do to harness the expertise of real teachers and educators across the country? Let me do this. One idea that came out actually out of the symposium was paying teachers or paying people to write down what they're doing, like as they're writing pilots, and then giving them an additional stipend in the summer to be able to write that up. it actually, in the large scale, is not that expensive to do, but it actually values teachers' time, which I think is really important to do. But we could actually end up having hundreds or even thousands of these and really be able to have actual experts, which are the teachers, giving this information. Evidence should match the need and purpose. We don't need, like you do not need, if you are getting an app that you're going to use in 1 or 2 classrooms or class periods, having a colleague tell you that they tried it and it worked is enough evidence for you to actually try that yourself. But if you're rolling out a reading program for an entire district, then you're going to want to look for a lot more evidence. Sometimes you really just want to know, should I try it or not try it? Like you don't need to read the whole study that says like, it's a 0.2% chance of this and not quite sure when to do it. So we need to put this all in language that educators actually understand. ESSA is an opportunity. I mean, again, it lists all of this. We have the 4 different levels of evidence, so that's a place that we can use as we're thinking about this. And I'm actually going to skip this part, but companies basically should also be producing, depending on their level of where are their development. We have expectations for them. Learning science, if you're just starting, doing user research as you start developing, and then at a later stage, that's when you want to start doing evaluation and implementation research. So, here's what I think we need to do to do it. So define best practices, promote continuous evaluation and improvement, agree on common standards, make evidence-based practice a common for school leadership. If we're not training leaders, then we need to do this. Foster an experimental mindset, continue with evidence, harvesting the collective power and expertise of all educators, and then moving beyond what works to what works in what context. Okay. For me, this is all about equity. I mean, if we are not thinking and rolling this out in a way that we are making sure that what we're doing with EdTech is providing more opportunities, then we're doing a disservice. I'm going to skip this talk. Okay. So here's my challenge to you. I'll leave you with this. So I want you to, if you accept the challenge, to test something out in your classroom in the next couple weeks. And by that I mean try something, just measure it, however you want to measure it, reflect on it, and then share it with somebody. I'd love to hear about if you do any of that. You can get to me, katrinadstevens@gmail.com or at katrinastevens1. And then locally, there's some other, quite a number of events and opportunities for people in the Philadelphia area to kind of join in these communities. And similarly to what we were talking about at the very beginning, about how do we start creating this ecosystem. I'm actually excited for Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a lot of the components to really make a tight ecosystem. You've got some really strong higher ed. You've got a number of range of different kinds of schools here. You have a vibrant tech community and a vibrant startup community. So there's a lot of really great potential here, figuring out like how do you harness that all collectively. And I think Drexel's doing some really interesting stuff, as are some of the other organizations locally. And so thank you.
Okay, we're going to put the slide up with the ways to text and tweet your questions at us. There we go. Great. Well, thank you, Katrina. Just really great thoughts. So many things going through my head right now. So you talked a lot about sort of the disconnect between traditional research and how, well, EdTech is evaluated, or even classroom activities are evaluated in some ways. Can you give us an example of where that's, maybe not in a traditional research sense, but maybe a researcher-classroom collaboration where it's actually working?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a number of them. In fact, the Kauffman Foundation just gave small research grants to a number of the education innovation clusters to be able to add a researcher to the work that they were doing. So the researcher literally was embedded in helping them think through, okay, as you're growing this ecosystem, how do we measure it? What does that look like? There's a number of people who are doing this in classrooms, where you've got researchers are literally embedded and doing kind of side by side. Candace Teal is doing some really great stuff out in California. I'm trying to think about some other examples, but there's actually the research practitioner partnerships is the place that I see it happening the most often.
And in those partnerships, researchers are obviously involved, and they're still probably doing their sort of academic publishing based upon that work, but again, it's a much tighter loop than the traditional controlled study. Is that the distinction?
It is, and I think they still are often writing those things up, but as they build, some of it's also that designing the studies to begin with, they design with an educator. So that you're, instead of going like, I really want to know whether or not kids learn this way, that going and talking to educators and finding out what the educators want to know, like what actually makes sense, what would be helpful for them. So more that you have that educator voice in the early development of a study, then the more likely the results of that study are going to be useful to educators. Melina, who's coming, I think later this year, is one of those amazing researchers who does all this. She has a complete lab that she's working on, but she also does PD. So she'll periodically go into districts and take that, what she's learning, and actually help educators be able to apply that in real ways.
Just for a little bit of context, I know we've spoken about this. You were on a track or trajectory to be that kind of researcher.
Yes, I was.
So maybe can you tell a little bit? Share the story?
Sure. So I was at Temple, and I was doing a PhD program on late Renaissance and late medieval and early Renaissance women's writing. And so I loved it, actually. I really enjoyed doing the work. But I got pulled into a local school, actually in North Philly, and realized that I felt like, as much as it was intellectually really interesting, that the work was not actually going to change the world in any real way. And so for me, that's when I left with my master's and then went back to and started teaching and kind of like jumped into that world.
Great. Okay, so we do have 2 microphones set up there. You are welcome, if you have a question, to use a microphone. You are also welcome to tweet a question to @ExciteCenter or to text a question to 484-588-415. I feel like we're running a telethon or something. But you can text it to that question, and a lot of times we get some really, really great questions from there. So actually, I'll take a question from I just received by text. So you mentioned teacher voice, student voice. How about parent voice? Do you know of ed tech examples that incorporate parent voice?
Yeah, those are great. So I think parents actually are important in that, particularly given, depending on what the ed tech is. There's out in Chula, I think it is, Chula Vista, out in California. It's near San Diego. They had a very high ELL population. And they,
I'm sorry, how very high?
ELL,
thank you.
so English language learners.
Yep.
They also had a huge disconnect between, they had kind of high poverty parts of their district and parts that were affluent. And they realized that they were getting interactions with the parents who were more affluent and not getting any interactions with the lower poverty. So they went to the community. They actually went and talked to parents and found out how would you better want to communicate and what were you interested in. And the parents helped design the app. And one of the things I thought was really interesting, the thing that they really wanted to know was the lunch. So apparently, the kids would take lunch money in, but it would not end up there, and so they would get these bills at the end of the month, and they wanted to be able to track it. But the fact that they cared about, the school was like, oh, and they designed that, suddenly those parents felt like they were listened to, and they participated more in those. And then as they started doing a one-to-one rollout, the parents actually did training with the schools. So I think that there are places where parents could actually be heavily involved.
And that's a fantastic example. How common do you think that? Is that an outlier, or do you think that's actually becoming?
I think it's more of an outlier. I think parents tend to be more active PTAs. They'll kind of be like, why don't our kids have this kind of tech? They're often PTAs that are raising money for tech. So that's the place I see it the most. I think that some of the missteps that happened with Common Core, for instance, if we had helped parents understand what that was. I think one of the biggest things was that parents couldn't help their elementary kids with math. And so if you can't do that, then parents feel like, okay, this whole thing is, I'm going to kind of just dismiss that all. But if we had figured out a way to help parents teach their kids math in that new method, I actually think we would have had a lot more buy-in. So I think there are places that we should be bringing parents in, rather than just kind of the fundraising side of things.
Okay. I'm going to go there in just a sec, but really quick, because you mentioned Common Core. Most people don't think of tech and Common Core as all that aligned. Can you just maybe briefly state your thoughts on?
So I wouldn't say that they're aligned, but they're not misaligned. So tech is a tool. It's not good or bad in and of itself. It's really around how can that tech actually promote practices. So there are parts of the Common Core, like for instance, critical thinking. There are other standards in the Common Core around kids being able to present and to create, and there's some media standards. So there are parts of it that actually literally, like tech can help students be able to do those things better.
Great. Great. So we have some people lined up. How about over there? Yes,
Hi.
we have a question.
Hi. First of all, thank you for a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I have a question from the perspective of investors and entrepreneurs. So right now there's billions of dollars that are being plowed into EdTech,
Yes.
right? There are funds in the US. Many of them are quite large funds. The UK, Europe, Asia's just generated a significant number of funds. And so it seems to me that part of the solution here is going to be related to the cycle of investment and business development and product development, right? And I was interested that one of your slides talked about different levels or different types of evidence as it related to different stages of a company, different stages of investment, so which I thought was terrific. So could you speak a little bit about how in any of the things that you see going on out there, how the kind of interests of investors and entrepreneurs are being aligned with the interests of trying to find the best evidence for impact and educational outcomes? Because it seems to me at that point of alignment is where the big shift happens.
And I don't think that's really going to happen until market forces shift, because it's most people who are investing generally are doing that for you want a return on your investment, and until people are starting to ask, like schools in particular, so until schools are asking for more evidence, then you're not going to see a lot of investors doing that. Now there are some outliers in that, like Rethink Education. Matt Greenfield cares deeply about this. We've got Kapoor Capital also cares deeply about it. So there are people who are really heavily and have been in ed tech really from the beginning, because they're thinking about the double bottom line. But in terms of, we are starting to see it. One of the things that we did, the first project I did when I went to Ed was creating the EdTech Developers Guide. And then we did a 18 tour around, city tour around the country, working with developers and entrepreneurs to help them understand schools. Like, here's what you need to do to get something in. Like, here's some privacy stuff you have to understand. So part of it was just a general education around that. We have started doing, so that we had investors, for instance, at that convening in April, who were interested in trying to figure out, and they also trying to figure out what stage. Because what I don't want to see happen is that suddenly school boards everywhere demand that you have strong and moderate evidence, and that's actually not what the law says. The law says that, in fact, for the ed tech funds, most of those are going to fall into rationale. Rationale means you have some learning science behind, some theory why you think that this will work. And then promising is the next one. Most ed tech falls in those. So I want to make sure we don't go so far that suddenly we're demanding evidence that just doesn't exist or isn't appropriate. And I think that's helping companies, and then I have done workshops with and there are people also that are funding like Emerson Collective, or you've got CZI and some of these other Chan Zuckerberg initiatives, these more nonprofit organizations that are supporting some of this work in terms of helping them be able to, some of this we need to have some nonprofit funds that are going in to support this and helping companies figure out, okay, what point should you go get a study? When do you do a white paper for yourself? When do you go hire a researcher? Because too soon it doesn't make any sense because the tool's going to keep changing.
Great, thank you.
Okay, this fellow's been patiently waiting.
After listening to your presentation, I kind of got really curious about something. You mentioned that a lot of the resources are freely available, but how available are they really? Because, for example, from a researcher's point of view, if they wanted to make a study, for example, of a state or of a city or the entire nation even, they would take a lot of schools and they would look at the grades and they would look at the schools that are doing better, and then they would look at the factors that are making the school better. But how difficult is it for a researcher or just for somebody who is not necessarily involved with the school district and or with any large institutions to just go in and do that? And is it possible to make it more
Yeah.
available if it's not?
So I think it's actually really hard. So it's hard for companies to get into schools, and it's hard for researchers to get into schools without some relationship. The places that I've seen it the most, and that's the Education Innovation Cluster work we did, are places where there's usually some nonprofit entity that serves as kind of the mediator and helps bridge those. Because all that's really about trust. Like you've got to be able, there's so much going on a school side. You don't have time to like entertain everybody who wants to kind of come in and use your school or have access to you. So you want to have that kind of broker that's saying like, this guy's legit, like this company, this organization, this person. And that goes a long way in terms of being able to get into schools. But I do think we need to have more of those ecosystems. I think that Philadelphia is ripe to be able to have that kind of ecosystem built out.
All right.
Thank you. I think we have another question there.
Hi, I've seen from participating in EduCon and some other, I think when I went to ISTE one time, they were also talking about this, and some K-12 organizations about how a lot of teachers run into the issue with ed tech where they're dealing with minors and getting new especially not so much equipment, but using online software and all that, getting that through. And I was just wondering if you had any experience with that and how much it holds up, with all this time that it takes to implement this stuff.
Mm-hmm. So all real stuff. I mean, that's so P-Tech is a website that actually talks through all the different laws in terms, because there's laws for kids who are under 13, different set of laws that kind of step in terms of, so there's privacy issues as an addition to, theoretically you're not supposed to be on Facebook if you're under 13. Based on the law, but that's not, kids figured out how to create another account to do those. So one of that's just really having a lot of education in terms of digital citizenship and really being able to help educators know when they can use which kinds of things. A lot of the work we did on the EdTech Developers Guide was actually around working on the people who are creating the tools and helping them understand those laws and those rules so that they were not, because they would have some great idea that gets pitched to me, but you literally legally can't do that in a school. Where they would do a business model and we're going to sell advertising. You can't, you by law, you can't have advertising in a school product. So it's it's also trying to help have more communication across those different groups to be able to do that. The other thing I've often worked with developers too on is that they can't just build something on the newest, the newest Chrome that's come out, browser that's come out. There are people that are still on Internet Explorer. They've got to actually go into real schools, and I've sent them. I've literally sent developers, and you got to go sit and watch. It may seem like it only takes a minute to load, but if that's 30 kids in a classroom, and elementary kids, and it's taken a minute to load, you've lost them, and they're never going to use that tool. So there are some realities of that I think trying to get those two groups to talk more to each other and actually really see what that looks like.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we have one question over there.
Yes, so excited about your focus on evidence. It's really heartening, and I'm so thrilled to see that that's the focus of what you're doing. I'm wondering though, what kind of evidence do we have about the costs that children incur through all of this experimentation?
Mm-hmm.
Your example about taking that language out of the flyer that goes home
Right.
really brings it home. So parents are worried about the costs of experimentation on their child. Is there a way, or maybe you guys are already doing this, tracking costs, to children of all this kind of, and I know I'm not coming at this from a hostile, I want to do ed tech, I've been investing in it, I'm learning, I'm trying to do it, but I've become more and more concerned actually about that.
I talk about it as no, it's actually a really good question. I talk about it in terms of guardrails, that if you're going to be setting up pilots with kids, that there's some guardrails put around it. It's not the same as doing a consumer product. And what's interesting is one of the reasons that schools don't want to do RCTs, random control trials, is because they assume that the treatment, whatever that app is actually going to benefit. So there's already a bias, and I actually want to say in fact it might not. There are times when it doesn't work. But figuring out how do we allow schools kids to still benefit. So say something doesn't work very well, when do you cut it off? Build that into it in the early part, that if something really isn't. And being really careful with our more fragile populations. They shouldn't be the kids that we try something for the first time. It's finding, and some of those places can be out of school spaces. So if you're early creating an ed tech tool, try it at after school programs and other environments that don't have quite the same high stakes. So that's one way to kind of think about it. The other part is that kind of what I was talking about before, we literally are experimenting every day. We just don't think about it that way. Like I was trying things differently in my classroom, I was trying things in my district. Everybody's doing that across the country. For me, the more interesting part is like, how are we capturing what we learned from that? Because we just keep repeating it over and over and over again. The next year, we're gonna have all that same sets of teachers across the country who are gonna start doing the same pilots that just happened this year, and we didn't learn anything from any of that.
So actually, I'll follow up on that because I think part of it comes from a place of, there's so much transformation in consumer tech, right? And we see that, and they're the people who think, oh, why isn't it changing faster?
Right.
Or then, oh my God, things are changing so fast, well, can we slow it down as well? But ed tech doesn't seem to be following the same track as consumer tech.
Not at all.
And so can you talk maybe just a little bit about trying to align, whether it's incentives or, needs or challenges, so that we can benefit a little more from the consumer tech advances that are happening?
Yeah, if I understand what you're asking. So how are we able to take the kind of, like, so for instance, there's a lean startup method that's like we build a minimally viable product. How do we use that and to learn what we learned from this? Like, how do you use that in a classroom? And so one of the things is like working with teachers to help them think about that experimental mindset and what they're doing. But I think that there are, so for instance, we made some, gamification is a good one to think about. Like there's some real advances that have been made in terms of what games look like. If you can take some of that technology and do what I call like stealth assessment, so kids are playing a game and don't even realize that they're learning something or they're being tested on something, like those are ways that you can kind of transfer and translate that work over. But it's not actually easy, and you can't, one of the things that's frustrating for developers is that if they fix something, they want to roll it out right away. And if you just spend time working with a district to set that all up and do professional development, like there's only certain times when you can roll out something new. And so it is much slower process, and it's going to be hard to actually get around and to do that.
Okay, great. I think we have another one at the microphone.
Hi, I'm trying to find out, I work for a private school, and I was wondering how to make that connection with people who are doing the research and maybe companies who have these various ed tech tools, and maybe, our school could be some kind of like a platform or a training center or like a trial center. So I'd just like to know how to get in touch with maybe that wide body of people who are doing that work. And then also, I would also like if you could make a comment on the usefulness of all this technology in the classroom, because being in the classroom, well, I don't teach, but I'm an administrator, and I see a lot of issues with tech in the classroom where we're not focusing on basic skills, and we're leaving a lot of that behind, and so many kids are rushing to tech and technology and how to write short, ways to write. Writing skills are deteriorating, reading skills are deteriorating, and I believe a lot of that has to do with maybe too much access to technology and too much access to a lot of fast tools and not enough stress and maybe focus on basic skills. And since you've been a teacher for so many years, I was just wondering if you could comment on, okay, we know that tech is useful, but how can we make sure that we're not losing a lot of those basic skills that so many kids need and so many kids don't have right now, and they're struggling to learn?
So for me, it goes back to tech is really a tool. And sometimes it's the appropriate tool, and sometimes it's not. Like a book is actually an incredibly useful tool. Like it was a great creation. It has, like, you can turn and move things and access things at the same time. So there are times when that makes more sense. For me, tech is about when it can be transformative. So if I'm making a decision whether to use tech or not, if more kids might participate if I use tech to do something, that would be a decision. If that tech allows students to create something, to be able to express something in a different way, like they're able to put together a presentation that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, or bring expertise in, or kids who are rural and don't have access to AP or to STEM or robotics, that's when I think tech is about creating more opportunities. If it is simply taking worksheets and putting them online, that's a waste of time. Now, the one caveat is that having some of that data that we didn't have access to before, if we can get that information to a teacher so they can see where their kids are and they can make better decisions about how to help them the next day, that is one place I think that we're getting better at being able to capture that, and I think that will help teachers be able to personalize learning a little bit more. But no, like classroom conversations are really, really important. We need to not lose interpersonal skills. I remember when we rolled out a one-to-one program in Baltimore County, a lot of the high school teachers were really worried, like, if they go by my classroom when they're doing an evaluation and I don't have a tech out, am I gonna get in trouble? I'm like, no. Like, if you're doing an activity that doesn't make sense to use the laptop, then you don't use the laptop. You use whatever's best gonna help the students learn in that setting.
Okay. So yeah, how would you connect with all the research and all the tools, and how could you be like a platform or a trial center or a research center for anyone?
So one, I think Excite would be a place to, they would know some local things.
Okay.
And I got the sense there might even be some companies here that probably will come talk to you after this.
Okay.
I mean, people are always looking actually for schools that are like yours to be able to want to do that. There are a couple of chats, like on Twitter chats, where where companies and educators will often connect there too.
Okay.
And we can talk afterwards too and think about some more specific ways that you could do it.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're almost out of time, but we're going to conclude the way we always conclude these conversations, which is with the lightning round.
Okay.
So I have several questions that have been texted in, and we're just going to take these as fast as possible.
Okay.
And feel free to make your answers as short as possible. Okay, I wish we had a timer, but basically, lightning round begins now. How do we deal with the fact that there may be ed tech at school but not at home, that they lose access when they leave the building?
There are a number of companies and organizations that are working on creating both inexpensive internet to get at home, but Philadelphia does have Internet Essentials. There are a number of devices that you don't need internet to actually work to have it work at home. But that homework gap is actually significant, and we need to be paying attention to it.
Can access to technology make a difference in closing the gap between well-funded school districts and underfunded school districts?
Absolutely, particularly in things like AP and other kinds of more advanced enrichment.
Okay. Ooh. How has the current administration impacted ed tech?
Oh boy. Well, so I will say that when I was there, a couple of initiatives I ran, like Future Ready, was around, we had 3,200 school districts and 26 states that all signed up. It was 50-50. So we had 13 red states, 13 blue states, and half of the districts were. So ed tech can be seen as being, but what's happening right now is that it's just not being funded.
Is there a platform for teachers to submit or suggest ideas or what's needed for ed tech or app development?
There are smaller platforms, but there isn't something that exists. And that's kind of why we were talking about doing a consumer reports for ed tech, but there are some community ones that do that.
Mm-hmm. Is edutainment education or entertainment or neither?
I'm wary of some edutainment. I'm worried about the gamification because we lose the kind of intrinsic sense that you get from learning. So for me, there's a difference between using games to learn and using it as rewards.
How do we push back against ed tech hype? Because we encounter that so often.
I think being really clear about really pushing companies to be clear about what it is the product does and what it doesn't do, and actually asking for the evidence for it.
If you had one wish for a large tech company, an Amazon, a Google, what would it be?
Oh.
Involving education.
Yeah. That they take what they do so well in their own field and figure out how that actually could help schools work better, more effectively.
All right. What is the worst ed tech system or pitch that you've experienced?
I've gotten a lot. Well, any of them that are pitched designed to remove a teacher or replace a teacher, I dismiss out of hand. So.